everyone, welcome back to the channel, welcome back to Globecast. This is host Moonlight. Today we're joined by Yat Siu. Welcome, Yat Siu.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I hope everyone's doing well as well, and you can tell we're feeling extra Christmassy at the moment. So if you're engaged with today's content, or if you'd like to hear more from Globecast, please give us a thumb up, subscribe to the channel, and leave your comment down below. So welcome, Yat. I know you are the founder and also the head of listing on Animoca Brand. Would you mind giving us a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm Yat. I'm chairman of and co-founder of Animoca Brands. Animoca Brands is a company whose sort of mission is to deliver true digital property rights to all, starting really with gaming. We've been doing this really since late 2017, which basically means that we're one of the, I guess, earlier pioneers in the world of NFTs, I suppose you could say. We started off early with publishing CryptoKitties and being investors in Dapper Labs. And actually, one of our approaches, which is a bit unusual as a company, is that we don't just build. Like, for instance, we own the sandbox. We recently launched, things like Gamey and Power and Quid and the Olympic NFTs and so on. But we also heavily invest, right? So we were early investors in OpenSea, lead investor, the first lead investors in Axie Infinity, Sky Mavis, the company, and of course Bitsky and Wax and Decentraland, and basically over 100 companies, right? And back in 2018, 2019 in particular, people weren't that interested in basically crypto. Bitcoin, if you recall, wasn't doing so well, and people were already running away from the fungible token. And here we were telling the world, oh, you should buy and be interested in this non-fungible token, right? So I think that was sort of really difficult at the time. But anyway, that was sort of our history. Of course, today things are quite different, and of course the space has definitely become much more sort of mainstream in thinking, and we're kind of, I think, a company that is very much at the center of a lot of what's happening, just because of our investment exposure and also the products that we've launched, like the Sandbox or Rev Racing, or even today, actually, we just launched the Quid token, which was kind of exciting.
Congratulations on that, and thanks for elaborating more on many of the accomplishments you guys have overcome. And while we mentioned a few big names and as well as some futuristic concepts in what we just said, but what kind of drew you into the sphere? So how did you start your journey with crypto?
So, there was always an intellectual interest in decentralization. The roots of, myself anyway was, I was very early pre-internet, with things like CompuServe back in the 80s. So I'm starting to date myself here. I built one of Hong Kong's very first internet service providers, which was in 1993. So that's a long time ago. And, we were one of the largest open source deployments, particularly Linux deployments, in the late 90s, with Outblaze providing one of the biggest email platforms in the world, at the time, using Linux. And again, today it's commonplace to be using open source for everything. But in the late 90s and even up until the early 2000s, open source was a bit of a dirty word, because people were saying nobody would ever want to use code that was written by others. You have to have, highly secure and audited and sort of, managed code from sort of the smartest people in the world type of thing, right? And of course, turned out not to be that case. So we come from a culture that sort of really respects and appreciates, the open nature and the open composability that open source provided, and the whole sort of, frankly, somewhat chaotic but sort of democratic format of what the internet originally represented. And so when blockchain came about, now you got to remember that at that point, the internet itself was becoming more centralized because of the way that data was constructed. So when blockchain came about, that was actually quite appealing from an intellectual standpoint. But the emphasis was very much focused towards, broadly the financial aspects. Because of the token, because of Bitcoin, everything was very financially focused. And so it started to feel a bit more financial, speculative trading-like, which is really the roots of a lot of the whole crypto movement. And that was less interesting to us because our background wasn't really financially motivated in that same sense. But when we saw what non-fungible tokens could do with CryptoKitties, the fact that people could actually own their digital assets, their digital property, that got us really excited. because, we're a game company at that point. We're publishing games. I myself have been a lifelong gamer. My first job was with Atari, actually in the 80s. So I had a relationship with games and gaming where I always really personally felt it was sensible for us to own these assets because we invest so much time and effort in them, and we ought to own them, even if we don't want to sell them. It's just like a memento, like a historical aspect that meant something deeply to us. And that's basically what wasn't possible, because at the end of the day, we don't own these assets. And when this came about, the two main concepts was you own it, and the second one was the community maintains the supply and demand of the health of what was CryptoKitties, which is, of course, very primitive in terms of a design, but what it represented was powerful. That essentially the company behind it no longer can control what happens in the production. It had to be something that the community decided, how many kitties they would breed and what they would do with that. And that really gave power to the end user. So these concepts were really appealing to us. And that was kind of when the big light bulb went off and we said, we got to start supporting this and building it out. And that's when Animoca Brands really embarked on this mission to deliver true digital property rights.
Thank you. That's so impressive. Like you mentioned, it works both ways. So the needs and the demands of the market is the true momentum of, what drives you guys to produce and to, create. But I know you also studied music, back to a couple of decades ago, I guess.
Yeah,
so
no,
I guess
getting,
it must have
getting
been
older and older, but yes.
No, I guess it must have been a shock to maybe not just you, but people around you when you mentioned, oh, I wanted to start something with crypto, with computery, because I guess, in the last century, it wasn't kind of promising. Like it didn't sound as, familiar or promising to people. So how did you kind of change your mind from music to like something that's so, at that time, so intangible?
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. First of all, music wasn't my calling. It was my parents' calling. They were, immigrants basically from China, and they studied music in Vienna, which was, and so I grew up in Vienna. I was actually born and raised there, and because my parents were studying music and then became musicians, I was as an only Asian child, basically, I was essentially forced to do music as well, which at the time I thought was fine. But I wasn't really given a choice in the matter in sort of the typical sense. Everything that you've probably read about Asian tiger parents, it's all true, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I had to basically go and study music. And with music, it's one of those things where real talent is very, very easy to see, right? If you're good and music, it's one thing, but if you have talent, it really stands out. And of course, hard work is necessary to practice and be good at it. But the point is that there is a part where no matter how much hard work you put, those that have talent and hard work generally sort of stand out. And so I was in the category of hard work, but not that much talent in comparison, right? So I had to work much harder. And the computer actually was a device that helped me with that, particularly in the area of composition. Because for me, it was very strange to be composing music on a piece of paper. It was just not something natural for me. But with a keyboard, and at the time, keyboards were already kind of rare. And the computer, which was the Atari ST at the time, had a MIDI port. So I could plug the MIDI port into this keyboard. I could actually sort of play on the keyboard, which would then actually create sort of, the data points that it would then turn into notation on the computer. And that basically got me into coding and programming and optimizing that, because back in the 80s, very few people used the computer for that purpose. So I literally had to sort of create a tool that made sense for me at the time. And I put that software up on a platform, a pre-internet service called CompuServe, which of course isn't around anymore, but it was basically like an early internet type service, that wasn't decentralized, but basically an early internet type service. And I shared my software on that platform. And back then, people would put their name and address on it. If you liked it, you can send them money, right? And for me, very few people expect that they get paid. It's just bragging rights. It's just like, hey, I got to post my software and I got to put my name on something. And then before I know it, I started getting checks in the mail. I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. So I think that was kind of interesting. And I think the journey around sort of embracing technology was the fact that, growing up in Austria as very much a minority, right? That's one thing, right? In an unusual field relative to the rest of the world, the fact that I was also a child, but it didn't matter, because at the end of the day, I was still able to get a job in computers in the 80s because there was almost nobody out there who knew what I knew, right? And it also didn't matter that I was a child, right? And I think you see this trend in new technologies happen all the time, right? It's what you do and how you do it as opposed to, that matters more than, maybe just judging you by, your appearances, your ethnicity, or some other aspects of your background.
Thank you for sharing with us. And I mean, you mentioned a lots of kind of background stories and what kind of cultivates and inspired you to, get into the sphere. So what is the actual idea behind founding Animoca Brands, and what services do you guys offer, and what actually differentiates Animoca from other rivals, in the crypto sphere?
So as I mentioned earlier, Animoca Brands is very much focused on delivering true digital property rights, right? What that really means is that, we have a way now in which we can own our digital capital, right? Meaning that whatever we create in this virtual space, we own the data rights to this. Therefore, we can get, royalties, income, and all the benefits that capital can deliver. Right? So that's kind of the big vision. How to get there is why we decided to have a very strong investing strategy. And it's important to understand that when we made these investments back then, we're not a fund, right? So that means we're not obligated to provide fund returns. We don't have an LP structure where we have to sort of give returns to investors in the same sense. Obviously, we want to give shareholder return, but the shareholder return comes from the value we help contribute to the ecosystem as far as we're concerned, not necessarily in pure financial terms, because we're also users of, for instance, tokens or of NFTs, right? So that's kind of one construct. And then, of course, we're building our own assets as well, our own metaverses, like the Sandbox or like Rev Racing or, Gamey, or now like today Quid, Tower, right? All of these are new ecosystems that we're building up as well. And the key thing is that all of them are open, meaning that they have to be able to be composed, be shared across multiple channels, right? Meaning that whatever I build in Sandbox could be used in some other metaverse as well, right? And and one of the reasons we would invest in companies like OpenSea, and this is of course a long time ago, was because they would help, evangelize the use of non-fungible tokens, the trade of these items. When you're building an open ecosystem, you can't do it yourself, right? It's not possible. You need as many friends as you can to build it up, right? People who share a similar vision. And what's the best way to get the people to work together is to enable them, right? And not to compete with them, in fact. And I think this is the other thing that we love so much about Web3, which is that because it's all open, the network effect is effectively shared, which basically means that even if the business itself might not be entirely complementary to what you do, because the assets are transferable, because the growth contributes to the network effect of the entire ecosystem, ultimately the network benefit trickles down, right? Just like you have in a country, right? If the economy of a country is doing really, really well, then broadly people who live in this country do well, right? And that's basically the kind of spirit that we see and our basically approach to everything that we're doing in the open metaverse with non-fungible tokens, right? Which basically means that we have essentially half of our business very focused on the investing side and half of our business focused on growing operating businesses like the Sandbox or Rev Racing and so forth.
That's so inspirational. Like you mentioned, you're almost creating this greenhouse, to cultivate all sort of talents, designs, and new technology, metaverse, development of the whole kind of society and community. And I know earlier in October, Animoca utilized, some popular brands like gamification, AI, blockchain, non-fungible tokens. Like you mentioned, people were not even familiar with fungible tokens, but right now they have been introduced to this non-fungible tokens and some mobile technology. So you guys actually closed a capital raise for, was it $65 million? So what kind of impact has it brought to the community?
So, this year we raised probably a sum total of over $200 million so far, over multiple fundraisers. The last one was $65 million at a $2.2 billion pre-money valuation. But, it's been quite amazing how the whole industry has grown. And so obviously we've been a beneficiary of that. And our entire ecosystem has been a beneficiary as well, because of course we use the capital to invest in companies, to grow others, to grow our own businesses as well. And what it does is it brings more people into the space, right? More sort of users that are experiencing non-fungible tokens for the first time. And I think the other thing that's happened as well is that if you consider, what the narrative of non-fungible tokens was a year ago, people didn't understand. Even just a year ago, it was a very small number. By the end of last year, there was maybe 150,000 people in the whole world that had an NFT. I mean, just think about that, right? We haven't even reached, basically, 7 digits, right? And that was the whole industry 1 year ago. And today, despite all the growth and numbers and billions of dollars of trade that happens every month in these non-fungible tokens, we're still only in the single-digit millions. That's the other thing. So while we've experienced a very rapid growth relative to where we were 1 year ago, right, which is of course massive, and this is what we're seeing in terms of witnessing the growth. There's 4.6 billion people online. There's 3.2 billion people who play games, who have a relationship with virtual goods as one of assets, actually, who think that what they're buying in a game, they ought to own, even though they don't. And so we think that runway will still go for a very, very long time before we hit any point of sort of, market maturity. And so the funding that we're receiving helps fuel that continued growth. Because one of the other important things is that people who don't understand this are actually not able to participate in this amazing moment in time. And our job is to try to bring as many people in as quickly as possible so that we can all participate, and enjoy the benefits of the growth of this market. One of the things about the earliest of internet days, and particularly with open source, is that open source actually provided perhaps one of the most amazing wealth creation sort of tools, if you will, that the world has seen. Because all these companies, in fact, many of them are the biggest companies in the world today, actually grew from open source. Whether it's a Google, whether it's, Lenovo, whether it's a sort of Xiaomi, whether it's, any company that you can think of today that has leveraged open source is actually, a giant of a company today. And because they leverage data well, but also because they know how to read code and they knew how to manipulate that. The problem is that despite the fact that open source has been so incredibly amazing, most of the world still does not know how to code, or certainly code well, which basically means we've inadvertently created a digital elite, a group of people who knew and how could interpret code and get the advantage. In blockchain, that's probably even more apparent, right? People who can interpret and read smart contracts and actually sort of interact directly with the contract have an advantage over those people who do it over a website or an interface, right? It's the same kind of a situation. But with non-fungible tokens, you can transplant the same kind of benefits, that you see in the world of code, but now you can do that in the world of culture, which is far more accessible because most of us interact with culture, not with code, right? It's not as technical, whether it's paintings or drawings, whether it's art, whether it's ideas, writing, that's what we do a lot of. And this is your creativity coming to bear, but without necessarily the same burden as having to know, how to code. And so the part of the thing of how do we make this more accessible is not just the platform itself, which is the engagement of culture, which I think is very accessible, but is making more people aware and welcoming them into the space so that they want to participate in this. Because, frankly, if they come into the space 5 or 10 years later, they frankly will, from our opinion, sort of miss out on one of the greatest opportunities to carve out a space that is theirs or could be theirs. I'm not saying that they're not going to have any benefits later down the road. I'm just saying that if we all go in as soon as we can, then we'll have a more equitable approach to the whole sort of construction of the metaverse. And that's really what we're hoping to achieve by making all these investments while we're also building our own metaverses.
Yeah, 100%. Like you guys, some of the OGs, pioneers in the sphere, as well as some of the newbies, new joinees. I feel like you guys are actually informing people and educating people. It's almost like, it's like all anthropology. It's like doing the ethnographic research, but just the community and, the whole like society, the tribe you dive in is the whole globe because the target group is so huge, like you mentioned. Everyone, on this planet Earth would have the chance and the opportunity to actually get to know crypto. And you mentioned that you guys now have kind of overall valuation of $2.2 billion after raising funds. And I know you guys got funds from many big firms like Liberty City Ventures. I'm going to mention a few names like Dragonfly Capital. So what will happen next? So what's your kind of future vision and mission when it comes to, future development?
Well, I mean, I think right now it's still early in the space. So we're going to continue to build out what we have right now in terms of bringing more people on board. As I said, we still only have millions of people in the space. There's still a few billion people basically to on board, right? Which means the work is cut out, right? And so that basically means that, we have some new titles coming out as well, like Phantom Galaxies, which is, a AAA blockchain game, for instance, and that's pretty exciting. But we've also made investments in many great projects as well that can help sort of fuel that. And so one of the things that where we're focused on sort of the higher end gaming style as well is because the players themselves who look at sort of the earlier blockchain games, they look at that and say, I don't know if I want to play that. I don't know if that's exciting for me, right? Because they're judging it based on what they experience, not necessarily what's underlying. But that's okay. So now we want to present them with the kind of games that they would love to play, irrespective of whether blockchain technology is underpinning. But then the benefit is that when they play these games, they can actually own everything, that experience and the time that they're spending inside these games, right? That's kind of exciting, and that's something that we really want to deliver. And I think the other thing around all this is that when you think about gaming and why we're still so focused on gaming, one of the reasons why games is a very powerful way of onboarding is that actually games really sort of educate and teach you how to play the game through a arguably difficult game, but through very immersive tutorials and structures that then make you play the game well. I mean, if you think about games, you have to understand weapon systems, you have to understand sort of, the lay of the land, you have to appreciate maybe the strategies inside a game, right? They're actually very deep and actually quite complex. And in fact, it is much harder to be learning some of these games than to be setting any kind of crypto wallet, right? If you think about it that way. And from that perspective, I think gaming is very powerful because through a fun and engaging and interesting way, you can teach someone quite a bit. And I think, again, we're still only at millions of users today, in terms of people who are sort of playing, blockchain and NFT games. But, to get to the billions of users, I think gamification and sort of game methodology is a very powerful way of doing that.
Yeah, and we've seen many kind of collaborations between streamers and crypto developers, many companies, as well as now eSports tournaments, and many athletes. They join the sphere. So what do you think that's implying, and what will be the thrives and falls for this phenomenon?
Well, first of all, I think gaming is something for everyone. One could actually argue that maybe life is a kind of a game, right? Because they've got rules, they've got establishments, they've got systems, and maybe life isn't a very good game for a lot of people, but it still has a method that sort of embodies that. And video games and the world of video games actually provides the same kind of elements where there's rules and structures and systems in places. And actually many of us maybe even prefer those kind of environments because it's where we feel comfortable, it's where we can achieve things. And I think with what we're seeing today with games and the different genres of games, whether it's action games, strategy games, or sports games, or whatever type of game that you enjoy, they're almost to be viewed as skills that you're very good at, because the world of people is one where we're very diverse in our capabilities and abilities. And here's the thing about the world of games, which is, I think, special. In fact, because so many people play games, we're spending billions of hours, really billions of energy, if you think about it, into something. And that energy actually goes into a benefit. That benefit, however, goes to the game studios, goes to the game company. So every time a person plays a game, he's adding value to the network of that game, right? Most people play for free. And so we somehow think that, because I'm not paying, I'm getting something for free. Isn't that wonderful? But actually, what you're really doing is you're working for that game. You just don't know it because you've been essentially sort of, taught that playing a free game is, basically worth your time because it's free. When in fact, as we know, nothing is free really. So as you spend time, your data, your time, your network effect that you contribute to the game goes to the game company, for which they make all the benefits. And then they sell it back to other players in some form of service to the player as you continue to contribute your time and effort into that. And I think this is where things like play to earn is so fascinating, because now I'm actually able to sort of spend time in a game. But if I'm adding value to it through my energy, through my time, then I will also get a reward for that, which has always been inherent there. It's just something that was never fully unlocked to the benefits of its end users.
Yeah, like you mentioned, time is money and nothing's really for free. And all the time and dedication you put into game is actually your kind of contribution. And that definitely costs and it's invaluable. So like we always know that crypto has, been called the future of technology and smart contracts. And we all hear those names like DApps, NFTs, DeFi, and they are regarded as the future of crypto. So what is likely to happen with the future digital property rights? And, while they revolutionize industries by expanding financial solutions, what will be kind of struggles and barriers we will be overcoming in the future years?
So the way that I think we look at the whole sort of metaverse, right, and the construction of it is you have multiple elements. The first element is with DeFi, as you just mentioned, and sort of the whole cryptocurrency scene. You've created a financial ecosystem, a banking system, as it will, that basically performs very similarly to the physical or sort of, I guess, real world banking system, but entirely in the virtual world in a decentralized fashion or in a manner of fashion in which we can all sort of interact with, fairly equally, right? So that's one thing. Then you have non-fungible tokens. What non-fungible token represents is the property rights, is the ownership of things, right? Whether this is like in the real world, you own a house, you own a car, you own a ring, right? These are things you own. Non-fungible tokens represent that same paradigm, basically, in the metaverse. And it's powered by basically blockchain technology, because blockchain technology is the layer, if you will, almost like the governmental structure that ensures that you can validate that ownership and that you have trust in the system because of the decentralized nature and the nature of that consensus. And then finally, I think the final piece of that puts it all together is the DAO, right? The decentralized autonomous organizations is a structure in which the people who own a part of that metaverse, as it were, that have governance rights and have a way to say where the sort of, assets and properties go. And I think this is the key thing here, which is that with a structure like this, you're now able to reconstruct the way that maybe companies operate, maybe even the way that countries operate or communities operate in this fully decentralized technological way in which you can build a scalable kind of trust that traditional organizations weren't able to do. And just in the same way that companies today, many of them or some of them are greater and more powerful than certain countries, I fully expect that DAOs to do the same thing, meaning that DAOs are going to be, more powerful than many companies, and perhaps therefore also, more influential than many countries. And so this construct is where the future is going. And I think this is an exciting time because of the fact that we can reinvent and recreate sort of an economic system that is no longer right for today. One of the problems in the past has been, actually, there's been many problems, of course, but one of the problems is that we're still living somewhat in an industrial age. Our schooling systems are essentially Victorian in nature, right? We're basically still not celebrating creativity, which is really, if you think about it, the most important skill that humanity needs, the creativity, the divergent thinking that we have, because of the fact that with the future of automation and technology, actually, there's no way that we can ever compete on the classic labor against the computer, right? The machine will win, right? And so what is it that we as people have that the machine does not have? We have feelings, we have empathy, we have creative thinking, right? And I think this is the thing that we need to focus more on. But the problem is that, existing education systems don't focus on that. Corporations are structured almost like treating people like machines, because organizationally and hierarchically, that's how we kept order. So we had to do that. But again, the machine can do this far better than we can. So why do you need human interaction, in the role of a machine? And so I think this is the opportunity that's exciting, because when you think about sort of the metaverse, everything that you do in the metaverse is actually something that comes from your headspace. It comes from your mind. It comes from your idea space. It comes from your sort of creative capital, as it were. And here, your creativity is truly capital, because you can turn it into something that you can resell, that you can have equity in, right? Which today doesn't exist in the same way. When I do and create something sort of out of my ideas, I tend to often sell it away or give it away far too cheaply to someone without long-term benefits, because the current economic framework doesn't provide for that, right? And because of this system, we've created outcomes that were zero sum, meaning, the way you conduct business was one where you try to outcompete others. And through the friction of that competition, you would have, I guess, a positive force of capitalism to drive innovation. But at the end, there is one or two winners, right? I mean, that's the way that sort of the path of that sort of monopolistic end goal. And then theoretically, governments are supposed to break it up with antitrust, but especially in the era of technology, they've largely failed to do so, because it's a space they don't fully understand, and it's hard to regulate in a traditional sense. With Web3 and blockchain, that changes, because essentially the network effect becomes shared across all, which means that we no longer have to look at a zero-sum outcome. We can look at an outcome that is collaborative across all, in the same way that, when an economy grows, actually everyone who lives in that side of the economy should benefit, right? Not what we have today, where an economy may grow, but actually maybe there's only a few market participants that benefit, and it starts with property rights. If most people in a country own their property or had sufficient capital benefits, then it doesn't matter that there is, it doesn't really matter as much when, what's happened recently, because everyone would benefit, because maybe the majority owned their property, and therefore they would still continue to rise and be sort of inflation protected, for instance, right? But because many people don't have property, and it's almost impossible for them to afford it because of the rate of actual inflation, they're basically left out. And so I guess the virtual world, the virtual plane, is one where I think these new opportunities can be developed. Because actually, if you think about our time, where do we spend most of our time today? Do we actually spend it in the physical world, or do we spend it in the virtual world? And I would argue that we actually spend far more time virtually. And more importantly, our virtual experiences are actually the ones that give us more purpose, that give us perhaps more meaning at the moment, not just because of COVID, but because think about what happens to your life if you actually are disconnected, if you lose access to Facebook, or if the Apple App Store removes your apps. What actually does it mean for you and your business? Likely it means sort of, the end of the road. And that means it's just a demonstration of just how important the digital world has. But then in that context, you must own a piece of that, because if you don't, you'll forever be a slave there. And that's basically really important. And that's why, where we see the future is that we must have ownership in this new metaverse. And in order to ensure that it protects the majority interest, the majority must be the ones that have a say in where it goes.
Indeed, just to add a brief note on what you've just said, indeed, like everyone, just look at your phones, like look at your screen time, how much time you spend on your phone, on your tablets, on this, little device that we all hold. It's just insane, because we all have this virtual social profile on there. And like you mentioned, metaverse is just it's constructed based on our own universe. It's based on how we think, how we imagine. So is there any, just to close up the interview, so is there any suggestions for those who are, interested and who are looking forward to joining this space? Anything to say to them? Any suggestions?
No, I mean, look, people who are already sort of, crypto natives, as it were, would find it much easier to participate. So my general suggestion is, as they're probably already doing, for those friends who they have that are not in the space, I would encourage them to try to sort of educate them, which sometimes isn't that easy, but educate them about the opportunities in that space. The second thing I would say, for all those who are really curious about it but don't understand it, treat your experience of the metaverse and maybe your first NFT purchase as one of a tourist. Just like how you visit a new country, you're not going to go in and just buy everything, right? And you're not going to go in and sort of think you know everything, right? In fact, when you go as a tourist to a new country, you enter the space with some level of anticipation and humility. You try to learn the culture. You try to interact, get to know their culture, eat their food, whatever it is that you do in a new country, you experience that. I think we need to approach for new people who have never been into the world of crypto, the world of the metaverse, the world of sandbox, whatever you want to call it, right? The same way. And when you do that and you approach it the same way, I think you'll find it to be a very enriching experience because you won't necessarily go in with assumptions. Just like when you go into a new country, you accept that you don't know much and you're there to enjoy, right? Whereas if you go there with preconceived notions or biases already, then of course it's harder, right? Because you go in there essentially with, sort of a walled approach. But if you approach it this way, then also, even if you spend some money, maybe you buy an NFT as your experience, not for a lot of money, and you experiment with it, even if that NFT is not very valuable, which many of them might not be, right? It's okay. It's like going to a tourist, and, to a new place as a tourist, you buy a souvenir. Nobody expects that when you buy a souvenir or when you buy a T-shirt, in London that says "Mind the Gap," you don't expect to make money from that, right? You just expect to enjoy that experience and to own a piece of a place that you visited. And I think that approach will then teach us about what the metaverse can offer. And the more you do it, I think the more you get to understand it. And then you'll have the confidence to do much more in that new world, which is the metaverse.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, don't have this preconception. Just dive into the culture, like you said, pay your visit. You might love it. You might fall in love with the place, with the sphere, and you might even, immigrate to the place. So you never know. You never know what's around the corner, and we shall see what the future holds for crypto. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yat, and thanks for everyone, who's watching the video right now. If you have any question, please don't hesitate to get in touch, and we have all the social handles linked down below for Animoca and Yat Siu. All right, we shall say goodbye for today then. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Oh, on a side note, Yat Siu is also the great mentor for Benjamin, who is our candidate for episode 8. So if anyone who hasn't been watching the video, go and watch the video now. And also for Yat Siu, like he mentioned, we believe in digital ownership rights, and also we are really excited to see what the future holds for crypto. And yeah, that's it for today. Thank you guys for joining us again, and hope you all have a great winter break. Love to see you. Bye for now.